Okay, so now we're familiar with our workspace, it's time to get into After Effects, creating compositions and using the correct terminology. So earlier on I mentioned that a new project in After Effects is traditionally labelled a composition. Again, due to the roots of After Effects being an After Effect program, which means that you would usually add effects to something once you'd rendered it out as a timeline, etc., or if you were working on the post-production side of things. After Effects is an essential tool for doing that. So you don't create projects, you create compositions. So in order to first make sure that we're saved correctly, you need to go to File, Save As, and first save your After Effects file. I've already created a practice AEP, so we're currently working in that. However, if you haven't, it's a good idea to save your work. So you can hover over Control S and save regularly so that if the program crashes, you don't lose everything. So in After Effects, there's two forms of compositions you can create. The first way is to create a composition which is good for motion graphics, which is where you would just be working with solid texts, pictures, images, etc., etc. The second is from footage, which is good for VFX work if you're working with live action, so you'd have some filmed work that you could add lightning effects to, or you could motion track, and you could add visual effects to the footage. Today, in this tutorial, we're going to be just looking at a new composition based on if we were creating the shapes, symbols, motion graphics ourselves without any footage. So you can go ahead and do this in three different ways. You can click this button here, which would create a new composition. You can go to Composition and select New Composition. You can right-click, select New Composition, or you can click the New Composition icon here as well. So there's four ways, sorry. And majority of these ways you can do from your project window or the main composition. I traditionally like to do it over here, so I'm going to right-click in Project, create a new composition, and call this Titles. So the other things to be aware of are your presets. It's good to know what resolutions you'll be working in for future reference as well. So for most people, we're going to be working in HD. So using the preset HDTV 1080-25 will be fine. Although you'll see there's lots of different presets in there. Make sure that you're working in one that's going to be the same as your output. So if you're working for film, 2K, 4K, etc., HDTV 1080-25 is fine for our purpose today. Make sure your width and height are also good. And make sure your frame rate is set to 25 and change your aspect ratio to square pixel if it's not already done in that way. Now you might find if this is set to something else, one of these settings, it's a good idea to choose a preset which is working in square pixels, and that'll just save you a bit of time later on. You've also got duration, so our composition is going to be 10 seconds. This time code would be hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. A lot of people change these two here to 10 and that would be 10 milliseconds. So just be aware that your duration needs to be whatever you want it to be. But for today, we're going to work in 10 seconds. Our background color, I'm going to just choose black, and then I'm going to hit OK. So you'll get a screen similar to this. Yours might look like this. This checker box is a good tool to see what After Effects is seeing. So this is, if I was to render this composition now, this is all we would see because this is what After Effects sees. If I choose this checkerboard here, I'm actually asking After Effects to see that background color that we selected earlier on. So if I just show you what I mean there, if I go to Composition and Composition Settings, you'll notice I told it to be black. However, if I put this as red, it would show up as red. So that's important to know for later on. You know, if you do want a black background, you'd have to create a solid black background for After Effects to know what's going on. Okay, so now we'll also see that the timeline has also been activated. So we've got our composition window activated. We've got something to work with in our project space. If you've got a scroller on your mouse, if you scroll towards the front, you'll see it zooms in, and scroll backwards, zooms out. You can also change that here too to fit if you just want it to fit these parameters. Next, what we're going to do is right-click in our timeline window here. You can also do it here as well, but if we right-click in here, you've got all these options. In New, we've got Viewer, Solid, Text, Lights, Cameras, Nulls, Shapes, Adjustment Layers, Photoshop files, and Cinema 4D files. We're going to cover some of those in today's lesson tutorial. However, you know, we will get into them in a bit more detail in future sessions. So at the moment, I'm going to choose New and Text. A viewer would essentially just make two of these. So if I click that, this is what it does. It duplicates your viewer. Then you could change this to a left camera if you're working in 2.5D or 3D. So for now, I'm just going to close this viewer so we have the one. So I'm going to choose New, and text. And I'm just going to type in here titles tool so you can see what's going on. Now with my text tool open, you'll notice my cursor has also slightly changed, and it's all just working in this layer here. If I was to click away from this layer and just press randomly, you'll notice it'll just create another text layer. So just be careful with that. If you're working with layers, you need to make sure they're selected, otherwise you can start creating other layers, which isn't as desirable. To go back to my selection tool, I just need to hit V on the keyboard, which enables me to move this around a little bit. And you can start to do little things to your, once you've created a layer, you can start to do little things to them, like adjust the scale and things like that. Just to be aware, if I did want to change the scale of this text, the best way to do that is to double click the layer and change the text here, just like I would on a Word document. It can be tempting sometimes to change the scale by using your selection tool and grabbing these corners. However, that doesn't change the scale, it just actually changes the, it doesn't change the size of the text, it just changes the scale of the layer. So if you'll notice the pixels there, they remain the same, but it's getting larger. The reason it's getting larger, if I just hit S on the keyboard to reveal the scale, I've just increased it to 285% when it should be 100%, which is like that, back to normal. So if you do need to change the size of your titles, make sure you double click the layer and adjust it here, the font. Now I did get into a quick keyboard shortcut there. Each one of these keyboard shortcuts we use today will just bring up that one shortcut. However, if you click on this triangle to drop down what you're looking at, you'll notice you've got text options you can adjust, and you've also got transform options that you can adjust, which can be really useful if you're wanting to animate any of these properties. So we just looked at scale. As you can see, I can adjust that. Position allows me to adjust it in here as well. Rotation allows me to rotate it, and opacity is how much faded it is. So again, these keyboard shortcuts would be as follows: S for scale, T for opacity, R for rotation, P for position, and I think I just covered all of them there. Essentially, the keyboard shortcuts relate to the first area, the first letter, should I say, on each of these words. So the difference is O is not opacity, it's rather T. And if you think of that like transparency, that's basically what you're getting. The other thing to note is that when we were animating or changing those properties, you'll notice everything was centering around this little marker here. If you go and press Y on your keyboard, it brings up this pan behind tool, and you can change your anchor point to, say, the middle of the layer. This will just enable you to effectively scale from that central point opposed to the left-hand side. So that's a really quick intro to the titles tool. The next thing is we're going to create a new solid. Now earlier on you heard me mention this was the black background because we asked After Effects to start off with that. However, if I actually wanted a black background, I would have to create it as a solid, and we can retitle this BG so we know it's background, make comp size, and click OK. Now After Effects works in a layer system, so this background and the title tool are layered appropriately. To see the text, what we have to do is drag the background under the text, which then reveals the text. So again, just something to be aware of. Now with solids, they don't always have to be the composition size. For example, if I wanted this to be 400 by 400, this enables me to click OK. And again, at this point, this black solid is now there. If I want to change the color of the solid, and I've done that by accident, I can go up here to Layer and Solid Settings. I can then change my solid settings from black to, let's say, red. And then we have something our text tool can interact with. Now, you can do all sorts with solids. You don't have to just use them as shapes and things like that. If we wanted to create a underline effect, for example, I could just sort of position these so they're near enough close to each other, and then I can grab the tool and I could make something like this. And then you've got a few layers all working together, and I can just rename this layer line. So now we've got ourselves a composition which is starting to take shape. If this was a title, and we're good to go. So so that is essentially a few of the things that you've got access to in here. We'll look at lights, cameras, and nulls and shapes in a future session. But that's essentially we're getting the fundamentals of what we can do in these compositions together. So I'm just going to hit Control S to save my project, and that's that for this tutorial.